Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are looking at something that is going to completely challenge everything you thought you knew about human endurance. We are looking far beyond the horizon to explore the most isolated people in all of history. We're going to examine these absolutely fascinating, true stories of individuals who were totally cut off from humanity for years, sometimes even decades. And we'll be paying special attention to the really ingenious practical skills they used, like how they sourced their food, how they built their shelters, and how they managed to survive the seemingly impossible.
Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to truly, seriously, imagine living so far away from civilization that you don't even know World War II happened. I mean, no internet, no phones, no newspapers, just an absolute total disconnect from the rest of the world. It sounds completely impossible in our hyper-connected age, doesn't it? But as you'll see today, these wild extremes of human isolation are very, very real.
To make sense of all this, we've structured today's explainer into four main groups. First, those hidden from the world. Second, those stranded against their will. Third, the loneliest man in space. And finally, isolation by choice.
Right, starting with Section 1, Hidden from the World, Escaping Civilization or Enemies. This brings us to the absolutely astonishing story of the Lykov family. Back in 1936, they were fleeing religious persecution, so they hiked deep into the remote Siberian taiga and literally just vanished. They were gone. It wasn't until 1978 that Russian geologists stumbled across this tiny, single-room cabin they had built entirely from hand-cut timber. To survive those brutal Siberian winters, the Lykovs had to develop some incredible practical skills. They survived on a really strict diet of potato patties mixed with hemp seeds, they foraged for pine nuts, and they meticulously fashioned all their own clothes out of homespun hemp.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the history they missed out there. It's staggering. When those geologists finally found them, the Lykovs had absolutely no idea that World War II had even happened, let alone ended decades earlier. They didn't know Joseph Stalin had died. And it was actually their very first time seeing modern technology, like a television. They were completely insulated from decades of major global events.
But, we have to remember the reality of their isolation wasn't just some peaceful woodland fairy tale. It was brutal. The mother tragically died from starvation in 1961, and 3 of the children later succumbed to the incredibly harsh conditions. This left just one family member, Agafia Lykova. She survived completely alone, relying on this masterly, deep understanding of her environment. She tended to her goats and chickens, she foraged in the freezing woods, and she endlessly patched up her simple wooden home to keep out the relentless Siberian snow.
Okay, moving from the freezing taiga over to the dense jungle, we run into the massive mystery of the Man of the Hole. Deep inside Brazil's Amazon lived a man whose real name we never even discovered. He actually earned his nickname through a highly unique shelter construction habit. Inside every single palm frond hut he built, he would dig a mysterious, narrow hole, sometimes up to 10 feet deep. Were these cleverly designed traps for capturing wild game to eat, or did they hold some deep spiritual significance? The truth is, we just don't know. What we do know for sure is a story of incredible resilience and honestly profound tragedy. He was believed to be the absolute last survivor of his tribe, left completely alone after violent conflicts with ranchers and illegal loggers destroyed his nearby indigenous community. For decades, he lived entirely by himself in the rainforest, continuously building his intricate shelters. The Brazilian government actually stepped in to protect his territory, monitoring his safety from a safe distance, but he actively avoided all contact with outsiders. He became one of the last completely isolated indigenous people known to the modern world. And this brilliantly illustrates the mind-bending psychological power of isolation. Take Hiroo Onoda. He was a Japanese officer stationed in the Philippines, and his orders were literally to never surrender. So when Japan surrendered in 1945, he thought the airdropped leaflets were fake. As years turned into decades, his fellow soldiers either died or surrendered. But Onoda used really intense, deep jungle survival skills to stay hidden. He built makeshift shelters out of bamboo and leaves, and he kept himself fed by foraging for coconuts and stealing cattle from local farmers. It wasn't until 1974, that is nearly 29 years later, that he finally stopped fighting a war that no longer existed.
Moving on to Section 2, Stranded Against Their Will, Geographic Isolation and Forced Adaptation. Just try to wrap your head around the terrifying predicament of French sailor Pierre-François Péron. He was left on Amsterdam Island, down in the southern Indian Ocean, to collect sealskins, and suddenly found himself 2,700 kilometers from any inhabited land. Escape was pretty much mathematically impossible. This is geographic isolation at its absolute extreme.
He and his companions were forced to survive on this desolate rock, subsisting almost entirely on seal meat and building these crude, patchwork shelters out of whatever random debris they could scavenge from the unforgiving coastline.
We see a really similar, deeply tragic fate with Juana Maria. She was the last surviving member of the Nicoyo people. After years of violence and tragedy for her tribe, a rescue ship finally arrived at San Nicolas Island off the coast of California in 1835 to evacuate everyone. But a violent storm forced the ship to flee before they could all board, and Juana Maria was left behind. Just like that, she was stranded on a remote island, completely alone.
And she couldn't afford to panic, right? She had to survive. For 18 whole years, Juana Maria utilized incredible practical skills. Because the island had very few trees, she engineered incredibly resilient shelters, constructed almost entirely out of whale bones she found washed up on the beach. She independently hunted seals and ducks, she foraged for roots, and completely adapted to a life without human companionship. When rescuers finally returned in 1853, they found a woman who had sustained herself through sheer ingenuity for nearly 2 decades in complete, utter isolation.
Okay, Section 3. The Loneliest Man in Space, Apollo 15 and the Ultimate Void.
3,600 kilometers. According to Guinness World Records, astronaut Alfred Worden may actually have been the most isolated person in history. In 1971, he traveled to the moon aboard Apollo 15. But while his 2 crewmates landed on the lunar surface, Worden stayed entirely alone in orbit around the moon. At his furthest point, he was nearly 3,600 kilometers away from his closest human companions. To put that in perspective, that's a distance greater than the span between many major European capitals.
So, the crucial point here is what happens when Worden's orbit actually took him to the dark side of the moon. The lunar rocky masks blocked all signals. Radio communication with Earth disappeared completely. For those short periods, Alfred Worden was truly, literally alone in the universe. No voices coming through the headset, no messages. Just nothing but the profound, terrifying silence of space.
Which brings us to our final group, Section 4, Isolation by Choice, Finding Freedom in Solitude.
Now, almost everyone we've discussed today was isolated by pure circumstance. But Tom Neale, he chose it. In 1952, he moved to Anchorage Island in the Saguaro Atoll, a tiny dot of land covering just a fraction of a square kilometer. He packed some basic supplies, sure, but he relied heavily on spearfishing and foraging for coconuts to source his daily food. He set out to intentionally embrace a radically simple life as far removed from modern society as possible.
Let's look at how this contrasts with our earlier stories, because Tom lived on his tiny island with literally just 2 cats for company. And he absolutely loved it. He loved the peace, the simplicity of his daily routine, the fishing, the gathering, and maintaining his small wooden shack. Even when health problems forced him to leave, he returned again and again. Ultimately, he spent many years living almost entirely alone. For Tom Neale, isolation was never a punishment. It was freedom, which is a complete 180 from the stranded sailors or lost soldiers we looked at earlier.
When you really step back and look at all these incredible stories together, they reveal something absolutely fascinating about human nature. Whether they were hiding in the taiga, lost in the Amazon, stranded on rocky islands, or floating alone behind the moon, these individuals endured unimaginable levels of loneliness. They prove just how profoundly adaptable the human spirit really is, using incredible practical ingenuity to build their shelters, source their food, and survive for decades without human contact.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. Could you do it? If you were to choose just one of these lives, the solitary survivor building whalebone shelters, the peaceful hermit foraging for his food, or the astronaut floating in total radio silence, which would it be and why? How would you source your food and build your shelter? Let us know your survival strategy down in the comments. And hey, if you enjoyed this explainer, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories from history, science, and the mysteries of our world. See you next time.